Please welcome Brady Corbet.
Hello.
Thanks for being here, Brady. It's great to see you. And before we dive into The Brutalists, can you tell us a little bit about your wonderful writing partner, Mona Fastfold, and how you guys came to know and work with each other?
We were introduced through a mutual friend years ago. Mona was married to someone else. And now we have a 10-year-old daughter. And we've made a lot of films together.
It's true. And this one, I know people should know, 7 years in the making, right? And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what came first, sort of. Were you already someone, and the two of you, were you people who were particularly interested in, post-war period or architecture, or any of the things that come together to make this such an interesting film? Or just how did you, it's such an intricate story that I just can't help but wonder where it began.
All of my films that I've made are about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic generations. My first film was about the 6 months leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles that inadvertently paved the way for fascist uprising during the interwar period. The film after that, Vox, was a film about post-Columbine, post-9/11 American psychology and how that shaped the culture. And so, of course, I wanted to do something on the post-war years after the Second War. And, brutalism is a style of architecture that came about in the 1950s. So it seemed to me that post-war psychology and post-war architecture were sort of intrinsically linked. So it was a subject I was interested in. And I read a book called Marcel Breuer and a Committee of 12 Build a Church, about Marcel Breuer working on St. John's Abbey. And that was sort of the jumping off point for the whole thing.
So for the architect character played by Adrian Brody in your film, was Breuer the primary influence, or were there other architects? Was it a kind of an amalgam, or how did you come to him?
Well, I mean, Breuer was certainly a jumping off point because what was formerly the Whitney, and then was the Met Breuer, and then it was the Frick, and now it's Sotheby's, is an extraordinary building and probably my favorite building in New York. But, the reality is that Walter Gropius actually, was able to station all of his favorite architects that were already very well established at American universities in the 1930s after the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus. And so I went to Jean-Louis Cohen, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but was an extraordinary architectural scholar who wrote the book on Corbusier, the big Taschen book. I think it's Taschen or Phaidon. And I brought one question to him, which was, can you give me provide me with a single example of someone who got stuck in the quagmire of the Second War and survived and was able to start, up with their firm again in the 1950s elsewhere. He asked me to leave it with him for a few days. He got back to me and he said, nope, never happened. And so that, of course, got me thinking about the fact that so many lives were lost. So many livelihoods were lost also. And the way that I was thinking about the project was that it was a sort of monument in and of itself, that it was, we went to the Bauhaus, went through the archives, and we looked at so many of the unrealized projects and buildings from these young designers that must have been so excited in the 1920s. You know, they had a vision for, you know, they couldn't imagine that after the First World War that they would see, you know, something like that again in their lifetimes. And it's absolutely tragic. And so I felt that the character somehow needed to be a sort of amalgamation of all of these visionaries that never got to see their projects through to completion.
Yeah. There's also a great love story in this film, and I know for you and Mona, that was going to be very important from early on as well. Can you just talk about that aspect of things and how maybe that evolved alongside the idea of having brutalism, but also the challenges faced by this couple at the center of the film?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, we wanted to portray a relationship that, you know, that we could relate to. You know, of course, in a David Lean film or a 1950s melodrama, you know, when she gets off that train, you know, everything would be ideal. But, you know, this is a film being made, you know, 75 years later. And well, I shouldn't have said that about David Lean, because Brief Encounter is actually kind of a very, very sad film. He made many, very, you know, very nuanced and complex films. But I just mean to say that we wanted there to be a very contemporary resonance, you know, in the relationship, and so, you know, they haven't been able to be physical together in almost a decade. And I thought that was really interesting, you know, that they have to find a way to sort of choose each other again. They have to find a way to be physical together again, especially when, you know, both of them have been physically tortured. I mean, so I was thinking so much about my grandfather who fought, you know, in the Second War in the Air Force, and he never brought it up, you know, but he was like in a plane that was shot out of the sky, and I thought about how in the 1950s especially, you know, you were not encouraged to express yourself, men especially, certainly not children, and so I was just thinking about all of that sort of repression, and it's interesting to me that the 1950s is a period of time that the conservative agenda seems to want to get back to. I find that very strange because, of course, it was a really miserable period in American history, and I can't, you know, my grandmother. My grandmother was a stewardess, and she loved her job. She was, I mean, can you imagine, like, being 19 or 20 years old and you've never left your hometown, and suddenly you're, you know, flying for Pan Am, and then you get pregnant and you get fired. And my grandmother had 5 more children, but I think there were more photos of her, you know, in her stewardess days than there were of any of the children in the house, and I thought about that sort of that anguish that she must have, you know, lived with for so long, and that which she could never express.
I think there's another thing, yeah. This film, when again, we're just kind of talking about some of the different pairings of character dynamics, but you have the architect played by Adrian Brody, and then the patron played by Guy Pearce. And you've, I think, likened you're interested. I get the sense in the artist patron relationship, not least probably because you've experienced some of that. I mean, when you went looking for somebody to make a 3.5-hour film with an intermission shot in VistaVision, which hasn't been used since like the 60s, I believe. Like, I'm sure you ran into some skeptical people as well. So anyway, can you just talk about
That's a very polite way of putting it.
well, just yeah, I mean,
They were mildly skeptical.
well, so talk about though how the film, what it has to say about that, because I think that seems to be of interest to you, right?
Sure. I mean, listen, building, making a film, which we've spoken about a lot on this promotional tour. They're very similar jobs. It's a managerial job. You're curating. You're relying on the support of others, and it requires financing and personnel, and it's not something you can do in your bedroom. And in fact, during COVID, we saw how we really couldn't do this in our bedrooms. Like, I think I saw about 14 or 15 COVID films, and I don't remember any masterpieces. But I think that I think that this sort of tug of war between art and commerce is, of course, inherently fascinating, and it's something that I'm sure many of you in this room work in the film industry, and you struggle with this all the time. And it's difficult because you're generally dealing with a representative from a company who actually has very good taste and has, but they're frightened. They're frightened that they're going to lose their job. And so, and when you're making something, you can't operate from a place of fear. You have to operate from a place of power. And I get it. I understand. I'd want to keep my job too. I mean, I'm freelance for life. I know what it feels like to be out of work. But I think that the problem is, of course, the vicious cycle of this, or the result of this is that, people are making bets that, are safe, quote unquote, safe bets. They're easy to support in a staff meeting. And yet audiences are not coming out to see them because they're so familiar. It's a formula. It's algorithmic content. It's just, and so, all of the films and this crop of films this year are notably very radical, daring, original movies. And whether people love our films or they don't, I think it's impossible not to acknowledge that this is one of the more interesting selections of contenders in a long time. It's predominantly, independent movies made by very radical, filmmakers. And I think that's really exciting. And I'm not really a glass, half full kind of guy. But I feel relatively sort of, kind of optimistic just tonight.
Well, thank you for sharing one of your more optimistic nights with us. Good to have you here. And
feeling great. Never better. 6 a.m. flight.
Right. Oh God. Well, thank you again for being here. And we're gonna continue in a little bit. But first, I want to introduce our fourth honoree. A clip of her work. She's a French woman who was nominated for the Best Director Golden Globe and Critics' Choice Awards and is nominated for the Best Director BAFTA and Academy Awards. Let's take a look at a scene from The Substance directed by Coralie Farjat.